So it's 957 BC. It's 957 BC, and you are Solomon. You're the king of all of Israel. And this is the day. Today is the day that the last of the lampstands have been lit. And the last of the seams have been sewn on the curtains. And last stones have been set. This is the day that the temple is complete. God rescued your people hundreds of years before out of Egypt as slaves, and they always had this desire to be in the promised land, to have a home of their own, a temple, a permanent place to worship God in. And yet, for generation after generation, they wandered through the wilderness, carrying behind them this tabernacle, this portable place of worship. And then they come into the promised land, and they're building this nation, and yet they do not yet have that dream of the temple take place. More generations pass, and finally David becomes king, a man after God's own heart. And he accomplishes so much of the dreams that God had for all of Israel. Man, he grows Jerusalem into a world power. And yet, the one dream God put on his heart to build the temple, this one big dream, he does not accomplish in his lifetime. Instead, he takes that dream and he passes it off to you, his son, to Solomon. And this is the day. This is the day that you are accomplishing your dream and your father's dream and your God's dream, and for generations, the dreams of Israelites. This is the day the temple is completed. And so you get up and you're excited, you skip breakfast, you run right down to the temple, you know it's done, and you walk through the doorway. Your eyes begin to adjust as you look around, and it's completely stunning. There's just walls covered in these huge pillars of pure bronze. The stones are etched for years, craftsmen working to carve all sorts of beautiful designs and animals into them. There's not a square inch of the place that's not decorated with some lavish stone or metal. It's absolutely incredible. You begin to move through the temple, and everywhere you look, there's basins, and there's lampstands, and there's these devices for the sacrifice, and those, and altars, and it's all of pure gold. And you smile because a lot of that gold was given by your own dad to make this temple. And so you take a little while to just take it all in. Man, we're able to accomplish this dream. Isn't this amazing? This is gorgeous. This is beautiful. It's exactly what God wanted. And you just kind of move through the temple. But eventually you get done and you walk out into the sun. And when you walk out, what are you thinking? Really, if you were in his shoes, what would you be thinking in this moment when you've just toured the temple, the brand new temple for the first time? You'd be thinking what? What's next? What's next? Right? The temple has just been completed at the end of 1 Kings 7. It says, when all the work King Solomon had done for the temple of the Lord was finished, he brought in the things his father David had dedicated, the silver and gold and the furnishings, and he placed them in the treasuries of the Lord's temple, and he was done. This dream that had taken generations and hundreds of years to complete, it's finished. So what's he thinking? Well, he's thinking the same thing that we all think when we have some great achievement. What's next? Haven't you found that this is the case in your life? Remember the day you graduated, right? And you're holding that diploma? What are you thinking? You're like, what's next? What are we going to do next? Or you got that first job and you get the paycheck. You're like, oh, sweet. Or maybe it was the day you got a promotion. What are you thinking? What's next? This is always what we're thinking when we have some achievement. And we know that it was what Solomon was thinking that day, because then in 1 Kings 8, we're going to read part of it, but there's this big prayer that Solomon calls together Israel, and he prays this prayer over them, and it's all about what's next. How is God going to use this dream of the temple to accomplish his bigger objectives and his bigger purposes? What's next? In a lot of ways, we are in the same position that Solomon was in that day. That Solomon had taken what had been portable in the tabernacle, in this tent that Israel had drug around with them for years through the desert, and was moving to the permanent place of the temple. They were making this move from portable to permanent, from tabernacle to temple, and asking, okay, what's next? In a lot of ways, we're asking the same question in our church. What's next? We've got this building that's amazing, that's awesome, and now, what is next? But here's the thing. This building that we're all so happy for is just a tool. And a tool is not the objective, is it? A tool is always something that helps you accomplish an objective, right? I mean, think about it. If you were to go to Home Depot, I spend way too much time at Home Depot, and you go to pick out, like, the coolest hammer, which maybe only me and Steven dream of things like this, right? You pick out the perfect hammer. And you were to come home and you were to put it up on the wall, and you're like, I don't use this hammer. I just really like this hammer. I achieved it. I was able to buy the best hammer at Home Depot. Aren't I awesome, right? There'd be a problem with you, wouldn't there? That'd be strange, right? That's the kind of home you go in and you're like, yeah, I actually have to go do something, right? Because a hammer is a tool, and a tool does not exist as the objective. It exists to achieve an objective. And it's the same thing with this building. This is awesome. God has blessed us with this building. That's incredible. It is the hand of God. I believe it. And yet it is only a tool. It is to help us accomplish greater objectives and greater dreams that God is placing in front of Mission Lakewood Church. And so today, what we're doing, because we are a people of God, and we are people of God's Word, we don't have to come up with some new this or that, or this is what I want, or this is what you want. We can go right to God's Word and go, when was the time that God's people were going through something similar as we are right now? And it was this time when the temple is completed and they're making this switch, the same switch we are from portable to permanent. And in this prayer of Solomon and in these events that happened this day that the temple is completed, just like this month we're moving into this building, it is complete for us, we're here. He begins to answer this question of what's next. And that's what I want to talk about today as a church. I told you all for a month, for 4 weeks, we're getting ready, right? We're doing this fundraising, we're getting things put in the church, and this is the other piece of this. We're talking about what we're going to do next. So all these 4 weeks, it's like a family meeting each week, okay? And this week, it's all about what God has next for our church. And part of this dream about what happened next for Israel, well, it came and it unfolded in an amazing and supernatural spectacle. 1 Kings 8:6. The priest then brought the ark of the Lord's covenant to its place in the inner sanctuary of the temple, the most holy place. So, real quick, Ark of the Covenant. Some of us, we only know it from Indiana Jones, right? Okay, it was a real thing. The Ark of the Covenant was like a big box, okay? And was covered in gold. And on the top, you can see in the picture, there's actually 2 cherubim angels, and their wings are stretched out to touch one another. And inside are 3 items: manna that had fallen from the sky to take care of people when they were wandering in the wilderness, Aaron's rod of leadership, and then the 10 commandments. And those were inside those boxes to remind people of one thing, that God is with you. He'll protect you. He'll be present with you. That's why on the top it was called the mercy seat. It was as if when it was put into the tabernacle, each time they traveled, that God came and sat down with his people there. It was all about the presence of God. So early in their wilderness wanderings, 300 years before the temple was completed, God gave this Ark of the Covenant to his people so that no matter where they went, they could be reminded by this box, this golden ark, that he was with them, that he loved them, that he was protecting them. So everywhere they went around the desert, they drug this with them and put it in the tabernacle. But the cool thing is that on this day, they got to put that ark into the temple because it had been completed. But check out what happens next. 1 Kings 8:10. When the priests withdrew from the holy place, so after they put the ark in there, and they withdrew from the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud. For the glory of the Lord filled his temple. Then Solomon said, "The Lord has said that he would dwell in a dark cloud. I have indeed built a magnificent temple for you, a place for you to dwell forever." So get this. The minute the temple is completed and they get the ark into the temple, God descends in a cloud, and he just fills the temple so much they can't even do the temple sacrifice. They can't even use the temple because of this cloud that has descended on this place. Now, why a cloud? It is no accident, actually, that it was a cloud. Generations before, when God had rescued them from Egypt, he moved with them in a cloud. We're told in Exodus 13:21, during the Exodus, so this is hundreds of years before, by day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way. So he went with them. The cloud, way back in the day, way back in their fathers' mother's day, that cloud went with them during the Exodus to represent one thing: I'm with you. It was God saying, I'm with you. My presence is with you guys. Don't forget it. And so now he descends in a cloud on the temple. And in this moment, there are now 3 symbols involved in the scene. You might have caught it. 3 symbols, right? There's the temple itself, there's the Ark of the Covenant, and there's the cloud. And all 3 of these symbols, the priority of that symbolism in the Old Testament is always on God's presence. It's as if God is saying this day that the temple is completed, I'm with you, I'm with you, I'm with you. My presence is with you. That day, those people, they got to encounter the presence of their Creator. And that's what I want. That's what I want. This building, our church building, the drywall and the lights and the speaker, all this stuff, it doesn't matter. It doesn't. It's just a place for us to come and encounter God. It is a tool to help us encounter our Creator. That's why it matters. The stuff doesn't matter. What happens here is what matters. And what I want is to have a place to come encounter my Creator, for my family to encounter God here, for people to walk off the street because they saw a sign and suddenly walk in and go, whoa, God is here. God is in this place. Isn't that what you want this church to be? Have you ever been in a church that it's not that way? You know, for some years, I was on staff at a church, and the church, it was just going through the motions. Have you ever gone through the motions like in a job, right, where you totally checked out? This is like a church that was checked out. It was just going through some religious motions. See, we took communion every week, but I don't think it was any different for most people than just waking up and going through the routine of eating their frosted mini wheats in the morning, right? Same thing. And the choir would sing a few songs, but I mean the choir because the rest of us, most people didn't sing. It was just going through religious rituals, religious routines. I bet you've been to a church that's a little bit like that, right? And you know what? As a pastor in that church, trying to teach people and lead people out of that, it was crushing. And I never want to be a pastor in a church like that again. Seriously, I would rather be the guy, I'd rather get a different job and be the guy that microwaves the pizzas at Chuck E. Cheese than be a pastor in a church where people don't want to encounter God, where people are showing up just to go through the motions, where people are showing up just to go through the religious routines. I want to be a part of a church. I want to lead a church where people are showing up to encounter their Creator, when they're showing up to expect to actually experience God, to know God, to have this encounter where they're like, God is in this place. That's the church I want to pastor. And that's where we need to go next. So what's next for our church? We've got to be a place to encounter the presence of our Creator. But actually, I've already got ahead of ourselves in our story. Because before this cloud descends, before the ark comes, there's actually the scene where what he does first. So Solomon's like, he comes in the temple, he checks it out, right? And then he walks out of the temple, and the first thing he does is this, actually. 1 Kings 8:1. Then King Solomon summoned into his presence at Jerusalem the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes and the chiefs of the Israelite families. Verse 3, when all the elders of Israel had arrived, the priest took up the ark. So actually the very first thing that he does is he gathers the people, right? He gets together the chiefs and the tribes and the heads of the families. He's gathering together all these people of Israel. And that was what this day was about. So what's next for our church? To me, that's a huge part of the dream of this building, isn't it? That we now have space, we have a home of our own where we can grow and gather our church family, where we can grow and gather our community. Already, I've heard people talking about dreams of heaven, a space to have a youth group, things like a men's Bible study, worship and prayer nights. Wasn't that awesome a few weeks ago, that worship and prayer night? Parties, dinners, new small groups, because this needs to be a place to grow and gather our community. And the church, it's a community that's always calling other people into it, right? That's how it grows. It shouldn't grow because you have the coolest stuff or you put on the best concert. It grows because you're calling people into a community. You're calling people in to be known and to know others. That's how it grows. That's the community we want to be. We want to grow and gather now that we have this home of our own. And believe me, having your own building as a church, having a home to call your own, it's where you want to be able to grow your church family. So when Megan and I first got married, we moved into a 500 square foot duplex in St. Louis. Yeah, duplex, meaning we only got half of it, 500 square feet. The whole thing was 1,000. We still only got half of that. Didn't even have a full kitchen. The hallway was where we put our dining room table. So if you had to use the hallway, you had to kind of move the table over. It was tiny, right? And in our little block of about 6 houses, in the last couple months, we lived there. It was, I think there were 3 felonies committed. It wasn't in the nice part of St. Louis. It was in St. Louis, right? It was rough, and it was no place to grow a family. So we moved to Colorado in 2009, and we moved to Wallis and Mississippi. And we moved into this tiny little second-story apartment, okay? And it was kind of a quirky little apartment. Last few months there, the kitchen floor was just plywood, but that's its own story, right? And the walls were thin, and our neighbors right across the way, it was this tiny little place, and it was listed as a 2-bedroom, but it was only a 2-bedroom if you were a hobbit, right? It was a 1-bedroom, tiny little place. And right across the wall from us, we shared a wall with a couple that they fought really loud and every day. Have you ever been in an apartment like that, right? And so it was actually okay that we couldn't afford cable because that was enough entertainment, you know? And so it was no place to raise a family. It was no place to grow a family. We needed a home of our own. And so we were able to buy our own house. In 2012, we moved to Green Mountain. We spent years fixing it up. And man, it became a place for us to have 3 girls. I'm completely outnumbered, right? And to start to grow our family. But we were only able to really grow that family when we have a home of our own. Isn't that kind of where we're at as a church, right? I mean, God blessed us so much, even though we were meeting in a high school that wasn't working great for us, even though that came with all sorts of challenges. God was still blessing us, but it was no place to grow a church family. But now God's given us a home of our own, a place we can grow and gather the family of faith. But it's not just for us. It's for us to grow this family. It's for us to invite our friends and our neighbors and our family members. It's to grow and gather. So what's next for our church? Let's grow and gather our community. So now that Solomon has completed the temple, he's called together the people, this cloud has come down, Solomon gets up in front of everyone. Everyone gathered there that day in Jerusalem. Everyone gathered that day right in front of this temple that just was completed, and he begins to pray. Here's how the prayer begins. Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord. This is 1 Kings 8:22. Stood before the altar of the Lord in front of the whole assembly of Israel, spread out his hands toward heaven, and said, Lord, the God of Israel, there's no God like you in heaven above or on earth below, you who keep your covenant of love with your servants who continue wholeheartedly in your way. So Solomon, he just starts his prayer with worship, right? Not with a bunch of requests from God. The priority is all about worship. And later in his prayer, he makes it crystal clear that what he's hoping for this temple, why they've invested so much in this temple, why they're so excited about this temple, is it's going to be a place for people to come and worship God. 1 Kings 8:33, when they turn back to you and give praise to your name, praying and making supplication to you in this temple, then hear from heaven. Solomon wanted this temple to be a place where people came to praise God, where people came to worship God, to make a big deal about God. And that is what we all need to do when we show up here on Sundays. If you're asking what's next, we need to show up here on Sundays to worship the Lord. That's what we need to be up to. Have you ever actually gotten up close to a street sign? You know what I'm talking about? A big street sign, like a stop sign or an arrow. A few of us in high school, mysteriously, we had street signs show up on our walls. I don't know how it happened, right? They're remarkably big. They're remarkably big. So I want you to imagine just for a moment that you're holding a big arrow street sign, right? And it's your hand. It's got one arrow on it, right? You get to decide what direction that arrow points. Because you are holding an arrow everywhere in life. When you go to work, when you're with your family, when you're with your friends, you're holding an arrow. And you're deciding whether that arrow of your life points to God or to yourself, whether that arrow is pointed down or up. And as a church, we have to make the same decision. We have to make the decision of whether we're going to use this church and this place to point to ourselves or to point back up to God. You can probably guess what I want to do, right? We need to use this church to worship God. That is what worship is taking our life and pointing it in the direction of God for everyone to see, orienting our whole lives in the direction of God to make a big deal about Him because He's worth it. We need to point that arrow to Him. Right now, though, in our society, isn't it normal to point the arrow back to yourself? To make a big deal about yourself? That's what social media is what I've concluded. It's like its only purpose. And that's rubbed off on the church. Haven't you noticed this? That a lot of churches, they take that arrow and they use it to point back to themselves. And so when you walk into some churches on Sunday morning, it seems like it's a club for their own comfort. And that's just taking the church and is using it to point back to yourself. Or maybe you've walked into a church and it seems like they're using that church on Sunday, that people are showing up to be entertained by a concert. That's just using the church to point back to yourself. Or you walk into a church and people are there because they wanted a inspirational self-help talk. What's that? That's just using the church to point back to yourself. But we're not going to do that. We are not going to take the sign of this church, the sign of our life, and use what we are to point back to ourselves. We need to show up here to point to God, to worship God, to make a big deal about Him. Wherever God brings us in the next season of our church, we must commit to this, that we're showing up to point to God, not to ourselves. So that's what's next. This place will be a place of worship. But God has more in store for what's next for our church. Solomon keeps praying. This is actually a really long prayer, and I think you should read it sometime when you get a chance in 1 Kings here. But he keeps praying, and he says this: "As for the foreigner who does not belong to your people Israel, but has come from a distant land because of your name, for they will hear of your great name and your mighty hand and your outstretched arm when they come and pray toward this temple, so that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you." Now, this sounds a little weird to us. He's talking about foreign. You're like, what's he talking about? Well, in that day, in that time in history, the only people who were worshiping Yahweh, the one true God, were the people of Israel. And so by foreigners, he's meaning those people who are foreign to faith in Yahweh, foreign to faith in the one true God. And what's his hope? Well, his hope is that this temple acts as a place for people from around the world, people who don't have faith right now, people who don't know their God, to come and find faith in their God, to come and fear God, to come and, what does he say, know God's name. In Mission Lakewood, this is part of the dream that God has for us of what's next. What's next for our church? Well, this must be a place for people foreign to faith to find faith in Jesus. It must be. In January 2018, we had our very first church service of Mission Lakewood Church. Jill was already talking about it this morning, right? And at that church service, there was a guy named Paul. I had never met him before. He shows up out of nowhere, and Paul starts coming to our church. He's in his 60s, right? And he doesn't know Jesus. He had never had faith in Christ before, but he starts coming to our church. And so he starts coming over the next couple months to a ministry we had named Alpha, and he starts asking good questions and getting closer and closer. And then on Easter, Paul put his faith in Jesus. I still have the little picture in my head of him raising his hand in the middle of the room. Man, it was awesome. It was awesome to have seen him come to faith and seen him progress so quickly. Around the same time, Paul was diagnosed with cancer. And by that summer, I was preaching at his funeral. And looking back on that, I believe with all of my heart that God used our church to change his eternity, to give him one last chance in the last months of his life to find faith in Jesus. That's the kind of church we need to be. A place where those foreign to faith find faith. If we can't do that, what in the world are we up to? And I get it. It was so hard to accomplish that for years. I mean, during the pandemic, we couldn't even get together. So how were people going to come get together with us and find faith? It was a challenge. But now, all that's over. We're sitting in this beautiful home of our own, and this must be a place where people who do not know God come to know God. It has to be. It has to be a place where we can invite those who do not know Jesus that we know from work or whatever it is to come and find faith. This must be a place like that. What's next? Well, this will be a place where those foreign to God find God. So just like King Solomon stood up that day at the temple, the day it was completed, the day they were moving from portable to permanent, the day where they were moving into their building and started to cast this dream of what was next. The objectives of how he thought that God wanted to use this temple building. Today we do the same. Today we do the same. What's next for us? Well, we have a dream of encounter, a dream of worship, a dream of growth, a dream of gathering our church family, and a dream of seeing those far from faith find faith. That's the dream that God is placing in the heart of our church. This is what is next. But the big question for Solomon was, how do you get there? How do you get there? How do you get there? If God is saying, here's what's next for you, how do you get there? How did Solomon and Israel get to the place where the temple was built and they began to use it to accomplish all these objectives as a tool? Well, it actually started with Solomon's father, David. God had actually put the dream of building the temple into David's heart. And so David, one time in 1 Chronicles, he starts talking about why he gave, why it was important that Israel's worship moved from portable to permanent. And so he begins to outline in chapter 29, verse 3 and 4, he outlines the resources that he gave out of his own pocket. He said, in my devotion to the temple of my God, I now give my personal treasures of gold and silver for the temple of my God, over and above everything I have provided for this holy temple. 3,000 talents of gold, gold of Ophir, and 7,000 talents of refined silver. And this is like hundreds of millions of dollars. Then David says to God, who am I? Who am I and who are my people that we should be able to give as generously as this? Everything comes from you, and we have given you only what comes from your hand. Our resources come from God, and so we sacrifice them to give them back to God. And to make it possible to have this home of our own, we do need to give generously. Now, here's the thing. Like I said last week, if you're just checking us out for one of the first times, if this isn't your church home, even if you've been kind of visiting us for a few weeks, but it's not your church home yet, I just want to tell you, we are asking nothing of you. I'm glad you're here. I'm super glad you get to hear about where we're going from here. You know, I'm so glad you're with us in worship today, but like I said earlier, that there's portions of each of these messages for these 4 weeks that are kind of like a family meeting, and this is the portion of this week's message that's like that. So this is one of your first times. It's not your church home yet. We're asking nothing of you. We love you, and we're just thankful you're here. But if Mission Lakewood is your church home, let me say this. To get to what's next in the future, we must give generously today. So last week, if you weren't here last week, I'd urge you to go listen when you get home. Not right now. That'd be weird if you pulled that up on your phone. To last week's message, where I outlined kind of why our church is raising $78,000 with a dream of more and where exactly that's going, because we want to be as transparent as humanly possible about where this is heading and why it is needed. And last week, I challenged each of us to prayerfully consider, if Mission Lakewood Church is your church home, to prayerfully consider what your role is in helping with that. Everyone's got some role to play in this as we are on this Tabernacle at the Temple campaign. So last week I said, don't even give anything yet. Just pray. Just pray. But now over these next 2 weeks, it is the time to begin to give. You can do that on the website now, but it is time to give. Now, what each of us give, it's not about the amount. Personally, I am a pastor, so I know I can't give 3,000 talents of gold like David, right? I don't have a spare, a couple $100 million in my back pocket. It's not about the amount, it's about the sacrifice. That something is given, and that it changes something about your life. That it hurts a little. That it's noticed. To get to what is next in the future, we must give generously today. We must give generously today. If you got questions about any of that or want to see some of the stuff we talked about last week because you weren't here, I'd love to chat with you after the service about that. But what is next for this church? What's next? Doesn't this building feel like a huge deal? It is. It is. Since the day we started this church, the day we moved in to this building, I think was the biggest deal, the biggest thing that had happened in the life of our church. I know we've only existed for a few years, but it was the biggest. This is huge. This is awesome. This is great. But it isn't the objective, right? It isn't the destination. God's got so much for us. He's got so much of what's next for us. He's got such a big dream for us. And now we get to use this building as a tool to accomplish his dream. Isn't that awesome? And it's amazing. If you were here last week, I told the whole story of how it came to be that we have this building. And man, God put it together. It wasn't me. It wasn't it was God. He made it happen over and over again. It's obstacle after obstacle after obstacle after obstacle. He just wiped out and got us here. And we're here, but we haven't arrived. We're here, and yet it was not the objective. This is a tool for us to move forward into what's next, into the dream that God has for our church. And so if you look across the neighborhoods around this church, you'll find that a shocking number of people do not yet know Jesus. That's what life is right now in our city. This place where so many people do not know him, have never encountered him, have never experienced God. But what if this place becomes the place to go experience God? What if this place becomes the place to go have an encounter with your Creator? And yeah, for years, man, we were setting up and tearing down. We were written in a high school, and we didn't have that home of our own. But now this place is going to be where we grow and gather our community for years to come. This place is where our kids are going to grow up together. This place is where we are going to grow together and invite our friends. This place is going to be where we grow and gather. And you know what? Yes, right now, if you look across the culture of our nation, even if you look across the culture of most churches, everything's about me. Everything's about taking that big sign and pointing back to me. But this place, what if this place becomes the place to go when you want to point to God? To go to make a big deal about God instead of yourself. To go to worship our Lord. And yeah, I know in Denver that we live in this time and place where there's so few people that are following Jesus. There's so many people that are completely foreign to faith. They don't even know about the grace that God offers them. But what if this place became the place where people found faith? What if this place became the place where people who are foreign to God came to know God? God has a dream for our church. We haven't arrived. The objective is so much greater and so much bigger. That's what's next. This will be a place to worship. This will be a place to encounter God. This will be a place for people far from God to find him. This will be a place where we point to him. Amen?